Prince Kalen was a masterpiece of biological engineering, but at the 50-minute mark, his perfection began to shatter. His golden skin was slick with a grayish sheen of exhaustion, and his strikes, once precise enough to split a falling leaf, had become heavy and desperate. Across from him, Jackson Reed looked like something pulled from a wreckage. His left eye was swollen shut, and a deep crimson stain was spreading across his olive-drab fatigues. Yet, he didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. He just kept circling, his boots scuffing the crystalline floor of the arena with a rhythmic, predatory persistence. It was the silence of a predator who knows he won't stop coming. The transition from the High King's arrogance to this brutal reality had been swift. An hour earlier, High King Vane had looked down from his throne of carved light, his voice echoing through the spires of Aethelgard High. He had called the Terrans physically inferior, a species of soft-bodied scavengers who relied on crude alloys and combustion to mimic the natural divinity of the Valkyrian. Alara had watched from the shadow of her father's chair, her heart tight as she looked at the human delegation. They were smaller, yes. They looked weathered, their skin lined by suns that weren't kind, and lives that weren't whispered into existence by gene weavers. The trial was supposed to be a formality, a way to finalize the war by showing the humans the futility of their resistance. Prince Kalen had stepped into the circle with the grace of a predator. He was faster than the human eye could track. In the first 5 minutes he had landed a dozen blows that would have ended a Valkyrian life. He hit Jackson with the force of a landslide, a display of genetic perfection that made the court cheer. But the human didn't break. He bent. He absorbed. He rolled with the impacts and retreated just enough to keep his heart beating. It turned out that the Valkyrian had calculated for power, but they had forgotten about heat. Kalen's magnificent muscles generated a tremendous amount of energy, but his body had no way to shed it quickly. He was a lightning bolt, blinding and lethal, but momentary. Jackson Reed was a slow burn. The human was sweating, a biological function the Valkyrian found repulsive. Yet it was that very moisture that allowed his core temperature to remain stable while Kalen began to cook from the inside out. Vane's smile had vanished by the 20-minute mark. By the 40-minute mark, the silence in the amphitheater was absolute. Alara leaned forward, her fingers gripping the cold railing. She saw the shift in Jackson's eyes. It wasn't hatred. It was a terrifying mathematical patience. He was using evolutionary grit against their genetic perfection. He wasn't looking for a knockout blow. He was waiting for Kalen's nervous system to misfire. Winning isn't about the hardest hit. It's about being the last one standing. Jackson took another kick to the ribs, the sound of cracking bone sharp in the still air. He spat blood, wiped his mouth with the back of a scarred hand, and stepped back into his stance. He looked at the prince, and for the first time in 1,000 years, a Valkyrian felt the cold hand of physical inadequacy. The human wasn't a scavenger. He was a persistence hunter, and he had finally run his prey to ground. Kalen's knees hit the crystalline floor with a wet, heavy thud. It was the sound of a god falling to earth. His lungs were laboring now, making a rattling noise that cut through the absolute silence of Aethelgard High. Jackson didn't strike again. He simply stood there, his chest heaving, his knuckles swollen into purple knots. He waited for a signal that wasn't coming, because there was no referee in a trial by combat. There was only the king, and the king was speechless. The air in the arena felt heavy with the scent of copper and the sharp chemical tang of Kalen's failing enhancements. Jackson's vision was blurring at the edges, the world narrowing down to the golden figure trembling at his feet. He could have ended it. A single, focused strike to the temple would have finished the Valkyrian line, but Jackson just stood his ground, a battered monument to sheer, stubborn endurance. "Enough," Alara said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the spires like a crack in the glass. She didn't look at her father. She walked down the steps of the royal dais, her silk robes whispering against the floor. She stepped into the circle, ignoring the guards who reached for their sidearms. She stopped between the two men, the broken masterpiece and the survivor. High King Vane found his voice, though it was thin and jagged. "He is a fluke, a biological error. Kalen was faster. He was stronger. This proves nothing. Jackson looked at the king, his one good eye steady and terrifyingly calm. He was, the soldier rasped, the sound like grinding stones, but he stopped. I didn't. Truth is, the humans hadn't come to conquer. They had come to survive. Alara looked at Jackson's hands, shaking from the adrenaline dump and the sheer agony of his injuries. Then she looked at Kalen, who was being lifted by medical drones, his eyes vacant and rolling. Her father wanted to start a war to erase this humiliation, to burn the Terran colonies until the memory of this hour was ash. He was already leaning toward his generals, his face twisting into a mask of wounded pride. But Alara saw a different path. She saw the strategic value of an ally who could outlast the stars. If the Valkyrian provided the technology and the humans provided the spine, the galaxy would finally know stability. Ironically, the defeat of their champion was the best thing that could have happened to her people. It stripped away the delusion of invincibility that had kept them stagnant for centuries. "The war is over, Father," Alara said, her gaze fixed on the Terran commander standing at the edge of the pit. "If you try to continue this, you will be the one who falls next. Not because they are stronger, but because they will still be here when we are too tired to keep fighting." She didn't wait for his permission. She turned to Jackson and offered her arm not for him to lean on, but as a gesture of parody. She was done being a decoration in a hall of arrogant ghosts. She was trading her gilded cage for a seat at the peace table, a place where the rebuilding would begin. Jackson took her arm, his grip firm despite the blood. They walked out of the arena together, leaving the High King alone in his palace of light, surrounded by the silence of a kingdom that had finally learned the cost of overconfidence. The human victory wasn't a fluke, it was a warning. And for Alara, it was the first breath of real air she had taken in a lifetime. "Would you like me to generate an image of Alara and Jackson walking out of the crystalline arena?"